Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Sustainable Finance Podcast, where you can learn everything you need to know about sustainable and ESG investing from leaders in the field. My name is Paul Ellis, and I'm your host for these programs about developments in this fast-growing industry. Hystar, the Norwegian high-tech hydrogen company, recently announced a Series B funding round of US $26 million to rapidly scale up to full operations with an automated gigawatt capacity production line by 2050. CEO Fredrik Mowill says the company's proton exchange membrane electrolyzers produce green hydrogen from water electrolysis using less energy than existing technologies and enable a substantial increase in hydrogen production output. In today's Sustainable Finance Podcast episode, Mowill will explain how Hystar makes the world's most efficient PEM electrolyzers for green hydrogen production, an important source of energy for the net zero carbon transition. Hello, Fredrik, and welcome to the Sustainable Finance Podcast.
Well, thank you, Paul. Thank you for the introduction, and happy to be here today.
Yes, we're very excited to have you on the program. Green hydrogen is all over the news these days in the world of sustainable business development. So let's begin today's program by telling our followers what a PEM electrolyzer is and how it produces green hydrogen.
Yes, I'll do that. Maybe talk about electrolyzers in general. There are different types of electrolyzers, including PEM and alkaline, but they basically work according to the same principles, and that's basically taking water, which is H2O, and splitting that into hydrogen and oxygen, and using electric power to split up the water molecule. So you have an anode and a cathode and a membrane in the middle, or an electrolyte in the middle, and that's the case for all types of electrolyzers, and that's how you get green hydrogen. So when you use water, there's no carbon involved, and there will be no CO2 emissions. So as long as you use renewable power, which is key here, you're using renewable power to split up H2O into hydrogen and oxygen. So then the only emissions you get are essentially some oxygen and some water. So it's completely emissions free, and that's kind of the definition of green hydrogen, contrary to gray hydrogen or blue hydrogen.
Yes, tell us a little bit about the other colors of hydrogen. They're not as clean, right? But
yes.
Are they also used for energy sources?
Well, definitely. There's every year, I think the global value of hydrogen sales annually is about $100 billion. So hydrogen is used extensively today, primarily as a feedstock for various industrial processes like ammonia production being one, and production of glass and pharmaceuticals and refineries and so on. So there's a widespread use of hydrogen today. The challenge with hydrogen is that on the one hand, it's the most abundant element in the universe, but on the other hand, it doesn't exist naturally in its pure form. So you need to get it from either water, which is green hydrogen, or some kind of hydrocarbon, which is gray hydrogen. So 95-6% of the world's hydrogen production is gray, and it comes primarily from natural gas, but you can also use coal or any type of hydrocarbon. But you essentially then need to, in the case of natural gas, you need to separate the carbon from the hydrogen in CH4, which would be natural gas, and that requires a lot of energy, point one, and it also generates a lot of CO2 emissions because you have carbon in the mix there. So that's gray, and that's what's being used primarily. And blue is essentially gray hydrogen, but where you capture the CO2 emissions. So if you're able to capture the CO2 emissions and store them or deposit it somewhere or use it in some way, I mean, you could produce more beer or soda or something like that and use the CO2 for that, and that then you essentially also have emissions free, but you need to capture that CO2 and ideally use it for something.
Okay. So thank you for that further explanation. That certainly helps my perspective in terms of what you're doing. Fredrik, Hystar's PEM electrolyzers have a 90% thinner membrane than conventional electrolyzers. And why is that important for the production of green hydrogen?
So the key thing with producing hydrogen in general, and particularly now green, which is emissions-free, is to be able to produce green hydrogen at the lowest cost possible. It's important to, for us as a company to be competitive, but even more important to unlock new market opportunities and applications, to get hydrogen down to a level where it's competitive with gray, and longer term even less costly than gray. And what's important to realize in this context is that there are losses, of course. As with any system, there are losses, but in an electrolyzer, the losses are primarily a result of the resistance across the membrane. So almost all of the energy losses are a result of having to push through protons and electrons through the membrane. And the thicker the membrane, the higher the losses and the lower the efficiency. So ideally, you would like that membrane to be infinitely thin. But the challenge with that is a fundamental safety issue, because as I explained earlier, when you're splitting water, H2O, into hydrogen and oxygen, you have one side of the membrane will have a hydrogen environment, and the other side will have an oxygen environment. And the purpose of the membrane is to separate hydrogen from oxygen. Because if you have too much hydrogen and oxygen, you get an explosive mixture,
right?
And that's bad news. So you need that membrane to be relatively thick. And it's not thick kind of physically. We're talking still about 150 to 200 micrometers. And that's sufficient to ensure that you don't have too much hydrogen crossing over from the cathode to the anode, so from the hydrogen to the oxygen side. So what we have done is we have come up with a patented solution which allows us to use thin membranes. And you're correct, it's about a tenth of the thickness of a conventional PEM electrolyzer membrane. We're actually using a mass-produced fuel cell membranes, and fuel cell membranes are a lot thinner and they're produced in much larger quantities. So our technology is not centered around having come up with a new type of membrane, but it's allowing us to use a thin membrane. So by having that thinner membrane, we significantly reduce the losses, and thereby we have a much, much higher efficiency than what you would see in a state-of-the-art or conventional electrolyzer system. So the way we do this is we have an external, and you'll have to excuse me, Paul, if I get too technical, then please hold me back. But,
okay.
But what we do is fairly straightforward, and we are taking external air into that anode side of the membrane where we have oxygen and where we don't want hydrogen. And we are using this thin membrane, as I mentioned, and we allow some of that hydrogen to cross over. It has to, because the membrane is a lot thinner. But we dilute that side of the membrane, that anode side, with external ambient air. So we have a continuous air circulation there where we are flushing out and diluting venting out effectively the hydrogen that's crossing over. And it's not a large quantity in absolute terms. It doesn't kind of have any commercial impact. We're not losing a lot of hydrogen in absolute terms, but it's very critical to keep that side of the electrolyzer safe and keep the hydrogen concentration below 2%. And we are operating at below 1%, and we can very accurately control the gas mixture on that side. And that allows us to use that thin membrane. Also provides an additional safety feature, because you could get a rupture in the membrane. That could happen to us, and it can happen to others. And then you'd have hydrogen gushing over to the oxygen side. And in our case, we can simply flush that out by increasing the flow air going through there. And that's an additional safety feature that you don't have in a conventional electrolyzer.
I see. So
that's
go ahead. I'm sorry.
Yeah, that's the key to the whole concept, basically.
Okay. Now, that's very important, I believe, based on the notes that we've exchanged, in hard-to-abate sectors of the economy, especially when you're trying to produce hydrogen at scale, as you've been talking about. So give us a couple of examples of why that is so important in these sectors of the economy.
Well, first of all, you can't electrify everything. I think that's one aspect there. There are a lot of people, when they hear about hydrogen, they immediately start talking about cars and planes and trains. And trains I think is a good application, by the way, but that's not the initial main market that we are focusing on. I think heavy-duty transportation will be important. So the further you need to travel and the higher the payload, the more relevant hydrogen becomes, because you get to a point where the battery becomes much larger than the payload, and at a certain point the math just doesn't add up. But electric cars, for instance, they function quite well. I drive one myself, and I'll probably drive a hydrogen car at one point, but I'm kind of in that particular interest group that would do that.
Uh-huh.
So you have transportation, which is a new market coming up. But what's the sectors that we are focusing on primarily in the beginning are industrial sectors where you already have a large hydrogen demand, and that's primarily gray today. So you're looking at steel production, ammonia production, glass production, various refinery processes. There you would need hydrogen, and a lot of these companies are now focusing on switching from gray to green. What's important there is to be able to provide a solution that's economical and that doesn't cost significantly more than gray, and ideally it should be on par or better than gray. And that's where efficiency comes in. So if you need less electric power to produce one molecule of hydrogen, that's key. And we can produce hydrogen compared to the state-of-the-art systems at 10 to 15% lower energy consumption. And if you're paying prime electricity prices, and you have a 500 megawatt ammonia plant, that's a lot of kilowatt hours and a lot of several $1 million per year of potential savings.
So that's where the interest by public and private companies and asset managers for investment in a firm like Hystar and the firm's green hydrogen technology is coming from. Can you give our listeners a couple of examples? You've talked about a couple already, but a couple of additional examples of why these investors are funding the development of your Hystar technology.
Yeah, so as you mentioned in your introduction, Paul, there's already a massive growth in green hydrogen and in deployment of electrolyzers, but it's a fairly recent development. So, the market, if you're looking at installed capacity in 2021, delivered capacity, I should say, was around 300 megawatts. And I don't have the numbers for 2022 yet, but it will be significantly up from that. And we will see gigawatts of electrolyzers being installed. There's no doubt about that, really. It's, how many gigawatts you could say. I know the EU have a target that's EU alone, to install 100 gigawatt by 2030. That's only 7 years away. And so that's point one. There's a big growth. It's a kind of a bit of a pioneering market. There are no kind of dominant players, I would say, and Hystar represents we're a relatively new company, but we have a very interesting technology that has the potential to do very well in this very, very high growth market. So it's a combination of a market that's growing fast and is expected to be a very, very large market in the, I would say, medium term. We have a unique patented technology that deals directly with making green hydrogen competitive on a large industrial scale. I think that's the general backdrop as to why investors in general have invested a lot within the green hydrogen space. And I think our angle or claim to fame, if you like, is that we have this unique technology, which is not something that's too... We haven't seen many other cases who are differentiating themselves with a different technology. There is a big focus on increasing capacity now. So all of the electrolyzer manufacturers are pushing hard to invest in production capacity and reducing costs, improving manufacturing processes, looking at alternative materials and all of those important things. And we need to do that as well and are working on that in addition to a continuous development of our technology. But it's this patented operating principle, if you like, that gives us the edge in that area.
That's really important, obviously, for your company. One of the things that I've spoken to other podcast guests about, Fredrik, in the recent past, is the idea of hydrogen storage. And in one case, we were talking about storage hubs in the U.S. Where there's good port facilities. Do you have any input on something like that? Why the development of hydrogen hubs might be of high value to the end users and the manufacturers at the same time, over time?
Yeah, maybe if I could start by answering that, to kind of take one step back and, the importance of hydrogen storage and the use of hydrogen, green hydrogen in particular, or especially here, is really partially a result of the tremendous growth in deployment of renewable power, sun, and primarily over the last, a couple of decades. That's been an unprecedented growth. And the challenge, of course, as is quite clear, is that when you get to a certain level of renewable power deployment, you run into some challenges. Technical challenges in terms of being able to deal with a very large percentage of renewable power that's unpredictable and intermittent by nature. And you get the economic effects of that as well, with massive price fluctuations. It's somewhere between 20 and 30% really in a country's power production, where you start to see these challenges, which basically makes it impossible to grow that renewable power percentage further without some kind of storage. So that's where storage comes in. So you could use batteries, but if you're talking about large-scale systems, that becomes less and less relevant. And so that's where hydrogen has become a key part in the continued growth in renewable power. We need them, they need us. It's a kind of a symbiotic relationship. And you need storage solutions, because you can then, at times where you have a surplus renewable power, which is basically free power or priced very low, and you kind of need to get rid of it, basically. You will put that into an electrolyzer and produce low-cost green hydrogen. And you can store that somewhere and transport it to an end user, or you could convert it back into electricity when you have very high electricity prices. You have a sort of an arbitrage there between kind of producing it at very low prices and then converting it back at high prices. Or you can mix it into pipelines with natural gas, for instance. That's what the companies are looking at that. So that's the reason why hydrogen storage has become important, and why you're looking at hubs or sort of building up green hydrogen installations in combination with very large renewable energy projects.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. I think it really helps me, and I'm sure our followers, understand that there's a lot of infrastructure in the energy sector already that is going to be used going forward with cleaner types of energy as well. So if you can tell our followers about Hystar's plan to install its first automated gigawatt manufacturing facility by 2025, how is that going to work out?
Well, I hope it's going to work out splendidly. We have started started the process, and we're busy talking to suppliers and partners who will deliver the automated assembly lines, which is what it is effectively. So, we are, as a company, assembling. We're kind of doing everything, I guess, except producing components. That's the best way to put it. So when we manufacture an electrolyzer, we actually source the components from established, well-proven suppliers around the world. And there are proprietary components according to our general designs, but those components then come in and we assemble the stack internally. And that's the gigawatt line we're talking about here, and that will be fully automated, primarily to ensure good repeatability and high quality. I have 200 cells that are stacked on top of each other. And that's a very repetitive task, which is ideally suited for automation. So we have designed our product to be well suited to existing automation technologies. But a lot of the important work happens with our suppliers. And since we're using a thin membrane and our components, as a result of that, all the components in the stack are much more similar to a fuel cell product than an electrolyzer. A fuel cell is essentially an electrolyzer in reverse, and they are mass producing a lot of these thin components, not just the membrane, but the bipolar plates and the porous transport layers, and all the components that go into an electrolyzer stack are also produced for fuel cells, but with those thinner components. So we are using, I would say, a different supply chain from a typical electrolyzer, and we benefit from a high volume supply chain with a lot of mass manufacturing processes, which are more cost effective than for the conventional electrolyzer components, which are to a large extent also produced in-house with many of the other OEMs. So they have their in-house manufacturing that they need to scale up, and I'm sure they will be able to do that over time. But we have this benefit that we can scale pretty quickly and move faster and benefit from an existing supply chain.
That's terrific. Well, listen, continue good luck, not only with your scaling, but with your capital raising. Fredrik, where online can our followers go to learn more about Hystar's leading green hydrogen production technologies? And how can they get in touch with you to learn more about the issues that we've discussed in today's podcast episode?
Best would probably be to follow us on LinkedIn. We have a pretty active profile there, and we announce most of the important stuff that we do on LinkedIn. We have a website as well, which is hystar.com. Mm-hmm. But our LinkedIn profile is probably a good source of information, and we can be contacted through LinkedIn or through our website as well.
Terrific. Well, thanks again to Fredrik Mowill, CEO at Hystar, and to our followers. Join us again next week for another episode. I'm Paul Ellis, and this is the Sustainable Finance Podcast.